Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for the two great presentations before me. I'm going to do something very different, okay? I'm going to talk about politics this morning, and because that is obviously so critical to addressing this problem. And I want to start by saying big change in America takes a long time. And the problem with this issue is we don't have a long time. And let me give you an example, healthcare. Franklin Roosevelt, when he was discussing Social Security back in 1935, let healthcare fall off the table. No healthcare was enacted. We finally, thanks to Lyndon Johnson and the big victory he won in 1964, we got Medicare in 1965. And thanks to President Obama, we got something that looks like comprehensive health care in 2010. That is about a 76-year process where people were talking nonstop about the need for comprehensive health care. And if some of the Tea Partiers are to be believed, we might not even have it yet. That's 3/4 of a century on health care. And we may not even be there yet. We don't have 3/4 of a century on climate change. And yet the American political system tends to work very slowly, particularly when it comes to big changes in large sectors of the economy. So let's review the bidding a little bit on the environmental movement, because I think there's some interesting things we can think about here. And it's particularly interesting to learn our history as we take this moment in time, and congratulations to the Carbon Tax Center for pulling this together. Your timing is perfect, because in fact we're about to set upon a new era of moving climate policy, and we need to really think about where we've been and where we're going. You can really start the date of the modern environmental movement in 1962 in the publication of Rachel Carson's famous book, Silent Spring. Now, for some of you in this room, 1962 is well before you were born. For some of us, it's not so long ago. That book was profound because what it did is it tied a phenomenon that people were seeing to science and to man's interference in the environment. But let me just point out what sorts of things she talked about. She talked about birds that were dead in your backyard. She talked about fish that floated on the water. She talked about people who got really sick from working with pesticides in agriculture and in other industries. In other words, what I call the first era of the environmental movement hit Americans in a big way, and it hit them in a totally nonpartisan way. You didn't have to be a Republican or a Democrat to be disgusted at the fact that suddenly the fish were floating upright in the stream near you. Okay, it was really fairly nonpartisan. Proof of that is that it was Richard Nixon who created the Environmental Protection Agency. Not exactly a bastion of American liberalism, and yet in those days this was not as partisan an issue as it has become. So I like to think of the first sort of generation of the environmental movement as starting from about 1962 and getting us established to think about clean air, clean water, and the things that EPA were founded to look at. And then, of course, we had, and I can't wait to see James Hansen in a few minutes, we had James Hansen's famous testimony in 1986, and that, to me, starts kind of generation number 2 of the environmental movement with the focus on climate change. And, of course, the contrast is obvious. No one can see climate change. It doesn't necessarily happen in their backyard. And it's a tougher political problem by far. In 1991, we had the creation of the sulfur dioxide emissions trading program, and this caused great excitement because it created a new paradigm for how we did environmental policy. Interestingly enough, at the time, environmentalists actually hated it. Okay, they said this was terribly unfair. You were allowing polluters to pay. And over time, this went away, and environmentalists came to see the political attractiveness to an emissions trading system. It wasn't a tax. Okay, and as we've mentioned before, not being a tax turned out to be particularly interesting and important. We then had Al Gore's documentary in 2006, I think it was, An Inconvenient Truth. Now, An Inconvenient Truth did for climate change what Rachel Carson's book had done for the first generation. It took in a visible way and connected science to what was happening in the world. And it sort of gave all of us a kind of basic science lesson. And we needed that. We really needed it on climate change because unlike the first generation, there were no birds dropping dead in our backyard. So we really needed to understand these big patterns. And actually things started to look up, okay? You had the popularity of this movie, which won an Oscar and was seen by many, many people around the country and around the world. Following on that shortly was the election of a Democratic majority in the House and Senate, and followed upon that was the the election of Barack Obama, and that was in 2008, and in 2010, the third cap-and-trade bill failed in the United States Senate and is pretty much dead. What happened? Where are we? Why, when it looked like all the stars were aligned, did we not achieve the goal of comprehensive legislation on climate policy? Well, the obvious first one was the recession, but the recession operated in two ways. First of all, it ended whatever romance there was with cap and trade. In fact, you heard Congressman Larson last night talk about how people didn't know what cap and trade was. Well, when they were told what cap and trade was, they didn't like it even more. And I'll give you a quote from a woman who was very much pro-environmentalist. As cap and trade was explained to her, she said, and I quote, "What? We're supposed to leave the future of the planet to the people who brought us the Great Recession?" Because once cap and trade was explained, Americans are not stupid, they got it real quick. Oh, this was about Wall Street. All you had to do to drain the blood out of the face of environmentalists was talk about credit default derivatives on carbon options. And they got it right away. Oh, this was another way for Goldman Sachs to make money, not necessarily save the planet. Second thing that happened, of course, is that the depth and severity of this recession took away any possibility that you could raise the price on electricity or gasoline without mammoth public outcry. And the politicians who were trying to propose cap and trade gave it made a great effort and ended up saying things like, oh, this will cost the average American family no more than a postage stamp a day. At which point you had to sit back and say, well, heck, if it's a postage stamp a day, why bother? Right? Because then, something's got to give. Either you're reducing carbon, and that's not going to be as cheap as a postage stamp a day, as some of these numbers that my previous two speakers showed will illustrate. Finally, there was an odd coalition that was just never going to buy this. And it was a coalition of basically coal state senators. And the coal state senators happen to also be the senators from the places where the recession has been longest and deepest and hardest. Places where unemployment is not 9%, it's 20%, and even that is probably understated. So it looked like we had a moment, right, with the election of President Obama, and that moment has quickly gone. Politically, this is pretty dead. And the question is then, as we work through the grassroots, as we work in Congress, how do we revive this issue? And let me give you two suggestions. One is give the money back. No policy is going to work that raises the price of energy for Americans unless somehow they're getting it back. And everybody else who's in this game looks at carbon taxes or looks at money coming from cap and trade and says, oh boy, we can use it for this, and we can use it for deficit reduction, and we can use it for this and that. In fact, Obama's first budget had a huge plug in it from the cap and trade system for basically deficit reduction and funding other things in the government. You are going to kill the environmental movement if, in fact, energy cost increases are used for government. It's an unsustainable deal Americans won't take anytime in the near future, and we don't have a lot of time to get this done. So principle number one is give the money back. You can give it back through cap and trade dividends, which I think is way too complicated. You can give it back through tax cuts, which, anytime you dangle tax cuts in front of Republican-type people, they get a little weak-kneed. So you might even be able to convince some Republicans to put aside their climate change doubts if they think they can talk about tax cuts. So first principle, you have to give the money back. Don't think you can use this for deficit reduction. Second principle is expand the conversation. When Harry Truman passed the Marshall Plan, in a most unlikely political environment, he was wildly unpopular. People had come home from the war, they were sick to death of doing stuff in Europe, etc. Harry Truman managed to sell the Marshall Plan to different groups for different reasons. And so, for instance, there were humanitarians who wanted to help Europe after the devastation of the war. He sold it to them that way. There were hardcore anti-communists who really wanted to make sure there was no communist governments in Western Europe. He sold it as an anti-communist movement. There were all sorts of, there were American businessmen who decided that they really needed to export to Europe. He sold it to them as business. There were labor unions who wanted those jobs. He sold it as jobs. He took, in fact, all of those different groups and brought them together. We have been remiss in the environmental movement in engaging with another group that we need to engage with. People who are sick and tired of having to fight wars for oil. We need to make the environment a national security issue. Congressman Larson spoke about it yesterday. We are on our third war in a part of the world which has no strategic importance to us whatsoever, with the exception of the fact that it owns 70% of the world's oil. So it's about time that we started broadening our conversation. For the time being, arguing climate change in a country that's in a recession like this is probably not very useful. And therefore, we need to think broadly at this point in time. How do we broaden this conversation? How do we think of all the other good things that could come from switching our dependence on fossil fuels to other modes of energy? So I hope we start that conversation today and this afternoon, and thank you very much.